The dust of Oakhaven did not settle, it merely hovered, a permanent haze of fine grit that tasted of dried sage and old regrets. It was a town built on the edge of nowhere, a collection of weathered timber and false fronts that promised civilization but delivered only survival. The sun, a pale, punishing disk in the bleached sky, beat down on the main street, baking the rutted earth into something as hard as iron. Into this unforgiving landscape stepped Mei Chen, her boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt as she descended from the stagecoach. She carried a single scuffed valise that held the entirety of her remaining worldly possessions. Her posture was rigidly straight, a physical manifestation of the sheer willpower keeping her upright. She had travelled for 3 weeks, crossing plains and mountains, chasing a promise written on a piece of paper that now felt heavier than lead in her pocket. The man who had written the letter, a supposed uncle of a friend who offered a secure position as a seamstress and bookkeeper, had vanished. The stage driver had told her as much, 2 stops back spitting tobacco into the wind and shaking his head at her quiet inquiry. The man had packed up in the night, leaving behind unpaid debts and a cold trail. Mai stood on the boardwalk, the wood groaning slightly under her weight. She was painfully aware of the eyes on her. In a town like Oakhaven, a stranger was a novelty. A woman arriving entirely alone, with the fine features and dark, watchful eyes of an outsider, was an event. The locals watched from the shaded porches of the saloons, the shadowed interiors of the mercantile. They did not offer assistance. They offered only the heavy, judgmental weight of their stares. May smoothed the front of her dust-coated travelling dress, the fabric worn thin at the elbows but immaculately mended. She refused to let them see her tremble. Her stomach gnawed at her spine, an empty ache that had been her constant companion since she spent her last coin on a cup of weak tea 2 days prior. She needed work. She needed shelter. And she needed to find it before the sun slipped behind the jagged peaks of the western ridge, plunging the frontier town into a cold, dangerous darkness. Her steps led her naturally toward the largest building on the street, a sprawling 2-story structure with a freshly painted sign that read Vance Mercantile and Exchange. It was the heart of Oakhaven's commerce, the place where goods were traded, loans were secured, and the lifeblood of the surrounding ranches was measured in columns of ink. She pushed open the heavy glass-panelled door, the brass bell above it announcing her arrival with a sharp, cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The interior was a cavern of smells: oiled leather, roasted coffee beans, lye soap, and the sharp tang of metal tools. Behind the long, polished oak counter stood Silas Vance. He was a man who wore his prosperity like a heavy winter coat, stifling and thick. His waistcoat strained against his midsection, and his smile was a practiced, bloodless thing that did not reach his pale, calculating eyes. He was the pillar of Oakhaven, the man who held the deeds to half the valley and the debts of the other half. May approached the counter, her steps measured and deliberate. She did not look at the barrels of flour or the rows of canned peaches, though her body ached for them. She looked directly at Silas Vance. She spoke in a clear, precise voice, her accent slight but present, a melody that made the merchant's eyes narrow infinitesimally. She asked if he knew of any establishments requiring a bookkeeper, a seamstress, or a clerk. She explained, without a trace of self-pity, that her arranged employment had fallen through. Vance listened, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the polished wood. When she finished, the silence in the store was absolute. A few other patrons, ranch hands, and townswomen had stopped their browsing to listen. Vance let the silence stretch, savouring the small power he held over the desperate woman before him. Then he smiled his bloodless smile. He leaned forward, his voice pitched perfectly, to carry to the corners of the room. He told her, with a tone dripping in false sympathy, that Oakhaven was a respectable town. They had no need for vagrants, nor did they trust the ledgers of their hard-earned businesses to transient outsiders of questionable origin. He suggested, with a wave of his plump hand, that she might find work in the saloons at the edge of town, where the requirements for employment were less stringent. The insult was not veiled, it was laid bare on the counter between them. "A woman near the bolts of calico," gasped softly, then whispered something to her companion. May's face flushed, a hot wave of humiliation washing over her, but she did not break his gaze. Desperation forced her hand. She reached into her valise and withdrew a small wrapped bundle, peeled back the cloth to reveal a delicate silver hairpin, intricately carved. It was not her most valuable possession. That was the jade ring she wore on a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her collar. But it was the only thing she could bear to part with. She placed it on the counter, asking for a trade. Just enough for a night at the boarding house and a meal. Vance picked it up, turning it over in his fleshy fingers, his mouth twisting in a sneer. He dropped it back onto the wood with a clatter. He declared loudly that he did not deal in stolen trinkets. He accused her, his voice booming now, of trying to pass off ill-gotten goods. He stepped around the counter, his physical presence looming, and demanded she leave his establishment before he summoned the town marshal to have her arrested for vagrancy and attempted fraud. The trap had closed. May felt the physical space around her, shrinking as the patrons edged closer, their faces masks of suspicion and idle cruelty. She reached for the hairpin, her fingers trembling just a fraction. The cold reality of her situation settling into her bones. She was entirely alone, entirely without resources, and entirely at the mercy of a man who saw her only as an opportunity to exercise his own petty tyranny. She turned toward the door, the heavy air of the mercantile suddenly suffocating, her mind racing through a bleak inventory of her remaining options, finding none. From the shadows near the front window, where the sacks of grain were stacked high, a man stepped forward. His movement was silent, the slow, deliberate shift of someone accustomed to moving without drawing attention. Elias Thorne was a man carved from the very landscape of the valley, tall, weathered, and unyielding. His clothes were the practical canvas and leather of a working rancher, dusted with the same ubiquitous grit that covered the town. His face was a map of hard years and deep silences, his eyes a pale, startling grey beneath the brim of his battered hat. He was a man who lived on the edges of Oakhaven, descending from his High Valley ranch only when necessity demanded it. He carried a reputation that preceded him. A just man, a hard man, and a man who had retreated entirely into himself after the fever took his wife Sarah 5 winters past. Elias had watched the entire exchange. He had seen the rigid set of the woman's shoulders, the quiet dignity in her face, as Vance tried to strip it away. He had seen the way she did not beg, even when her hunger was evident in the hollows of her cheeks. He despised Silas Vance with a quiet, abiding intensity, knowing the merchant for the predatory coward he was. Elias moved into the center of the room, the crowd naturally parting for him. He did not look at the whispering women or the ranch hands. He walked directly to the counter, his boots loud on the floorboards. Elias reached into his pocket and withdrew a silver dollar, tossing it onto the oak counter. The heavy coin spun, ringing sharply before settling flat. He looked at Vance, his grey eyes flat and cold. He told the merchant to give the lady her hairpin and to add a sack of flour, a side of bacon, and a tin of coffee to his own account. Vance's bluster faltered. He swallowed, the fleshy skin of his throat working, but he did not dare argue with Elias Thorne. Elias turned to May. He did not offer a gentle smile or a word of pity. He looked at her with the same practical assessment he might give a new horse or a stretch of fencing. He spoke in a low, rumbling voice that carried only to her. He stated that his ranch, Ironwood, was 10 miles out. He stated that his ledgers were a disaster, a tangle of numbers he had no patience for, and his house had not seen a proper sweeping in months. He offered her a position, room, board, and a fair monthly wage in exchange for keeping the books straight and the house in order. He made it clear through the flat, transactional tone of his voice, that this was not charity. It was an exchange of labor for sanctuary. It was a practical solution to both their problems. May studied the man before her. She saw the grief etched in the lines around his mouth, the guarded nature of his stance. She saw the heavy revolver strapped to his hip, a tool of his trade, not a prop. But most importantly, she saw that he was looking at her not as a victim and not as an object of suspicion, but as a capable human being. The offer was a lifeline, rough and unadorned, thrown into the churning waters of her despair. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. She told him her name was May Chen, and that her ledgers were always balanced. Elias gave a brief, answering nod. He told her his name, gathered his supplies, and gestured for her to follow him out into the blinding afternoon sun. The town of Oak Haven watched them go, the whispers rising like dust in their wake, eager to condemn what they did not understand. The ride to Ironwood was accomplished in profound silence. Elias drove the wagon, his hands easy on the reins, his gaze fixed on the winding rutted track that climbed steadily into the foothills. May sat beside him on the wooden bench, the jolting of the wagon jarring her exhausted bones. She watched the landscape change from the flat, arid scrubland near the town to rolling hills dotted with dark, twisted juniper and ancient oak trees. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of pine and cold rushing water. She did not attempt to fill the silence with idle chatter, sensing that the man beside her valued the quiet as much as she currently needed it. She used the time to build a fortress in her mind, locking away the terror of the morning and focusing entirely on the practical tasks ahead. She would prove herself indispensable. It was the only way to ensure her survival. Ironwood sat in a high, sheltered valley, a cluster of sturdy timber buildings surrounded by miles of open grazing land. The main house was a solid two-story structure of squared logs built to withstand the brutal winters. When Elias pushed the front door open, the stale air of a house unloved rushed out to meet them. It was not filthy, but it was deeply neglected. Dust coated the heavy wooden furniture. The hearth was cold and swept bare, and the windows were filmed with grime, dimming the afternoon light. It was a house that had become a mere shelter, a place to sleep and eat, stripped of all warmth. Elias showed her to a small, functional room off the kitchen. He pointed out the pump at the sink, the wood stove, and the stack of leather-bound ledgers sitting on a desk in the corner of the main room. He told her he would be out until sundown checking the herd. Then he left her alone. May stood in the center of the silent kitchen. She took a deep breath, the smell of old wood and loneliness filling her lungs. She did not sit down. She removed her traveling jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. For the next week, May attacked the house and the ledgers with a methodical, unrelenting focus. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the windows, letting the golden autumn light spill across the rugs. She found a neglected garden patch behind the house and spent her evenings pulling weeds and coaxing life back into the hardened soil. But her greatest battle was fought at the desk. Elias had not exaggerated. His books were a chaotic mess of hastily scribbled receipts, missing dates, and half-remembered transactions. Mai spent hours deciphering his cramped handwriting, categorizing expenses, and tracking the sale of cattle against the purchase of supplies. It was during this meticulous reconstruction of Ironwood's finances that May discovered the discrepancy. It was subtle at first, a matter of fractions and rounded numbers. But as she cross-referenced the supply receipts from Vance Mercantile with the banknotes held by Silas Vance's exchange, a clear, undeniable pattern emerged. Vance had been systematically overcharging Elias for feed and wire, while simultaneously shorting him on the interest calculated on an old, outstanding loan Elias had taken years ago to expand his herd. It was a quiet, insidious theft, designed to bleed the ranch dry slowly enough that a man who hated paperwork would never notice. Elias, for his part, watched the transformation of his home with a quiet, growing astonishment. Enclosed. He would return from the range, his body aching and covered in dust, to find the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread filling the air. He would find his clothes mended, the missing buttons replaced with neat, tiny stitches. He would see May sitting at the desk by the light of a kerosene lamp, her brow furrowed in concentration, the scratch of her pen, the only sound in the house. He found himself lingering in the kitchen, watching her capable hands work the dough or chop vegetables. The high, impenetrable fences he had built around his heart after Sarah's death began to creak and shift. He realized with a startling clarity that he looked forward to returning to the house. He respected her. He respected her silence, her work ethic, and the fierce, quiet dignity that radiated from her small frame. One evening, after the supper dishes were cleared, May brought the ledgers to the heavy oak dining table. She asked Elias to sit. She did not temper her words or soften the blow. She laid out the numbers, her slender finger tracing the columns of ink, explaining the mechanics of Vance's fraud with cold precision. She showed him the inflated prices, the manipulated interest rates, the slow siphoning of his wealth. Elias listened in silence, his jaw tightening, his grey eyes growing dark as a thunderhead. When she finished, he did not explode in rage. He simply closed the ledger, his large, calloused hand resting flat against the leather cover. He looked at May, his gaze intense and searching. He asked her if she was certain. She met his eyes and told him she would stake her life on the map. Elias nodded slowly. He thanked her, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. That night, the silence in the house felt different. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a space, but the tense, shared silence of a partnership preparing for war. The war, however, did not begin with a shout, but with a polite knock on the door. 2 days later, while Elias was repairing a fence line on the far pasture, Silas Vance rode into the yard of Ironwood. He was accompanied by 2 of his hired men, rough-looking enforcers who lingered near the horses while Vance approached the house. May saw them coming from the kitchen window. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. She wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her hair, and opened the door before Vance could knock a second. Time. Vance stood on the porch, his smile firmly in place, his eyes darting past her to inspect the clean, orderly interior of the house. He removed his hat with a mock bow. He claimed he was merely passing through, checking on his investments, and wanted to see how Elias's new arrangement was working out. His tone was dripping with poisonous implication. He spoke of the town's concern for Elias's moral standing, the scandal of a widower living alone with a woman of unknown background. He suggested, with a patronizing tilt of his head, that such an improper situation might cause the bank to reconsider the terms of Elias's outstanding loans. He hinted that the town council was discussing ordinances regarding vagrancy and the harboring of unsavory elements. May stood in the doorway, blocking his entry. She did not shrink back. She looked at the plump, sweating man and saw only a coward hiding behind ledgers and hired muscle. She spoke in a voice as cold and clear as a mountain stream. She informed Mr. Vance that Mr. Thorne was not present, and that he was trespassing on private land. She told him that the accounts were fully updated and that any business regarding loans would be handled in town during business hours with all documentation present. Vance's smile vanished. His face flushed an ugly mottled red. He leaned forward, his voice dropping the veneer of politeness, turning into a raw, ugly threat. He told her she was a fool playing a dangerous game, and that he could have her run out of the valley in tar and feathers before the week was out. He promised to break Elias Thorne and take the Ironwood land, and that she would be the lever he used to do it. He turned and marched back to his horse, signalling his men. They rode out in a cloud of dust. May leaned against the doorframe, her knees suddenly weak, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Elias returned at dusk, he found her sitting on the porch, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the road. "Maud," she told him every word Vance had said. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He did not offer empty comforts. He simply stated that Vance was a cornered animal, and that animals bite when they realize the trap is closing. He told May to keep the ledgers hidden in her room, and he spent the next hour cleaning and oiling his rifle by the light of the fire. The threat was no longer abstract. It had crossed the threshold of their home. The crucible arrived on a night when the wind howled down from the mountains, dry and restless, carrying the parched scent of late summer. It was the kind of wind that made the horses skittish and set the timber of the house groaning. May was asleep in her small room, her dreams troubled by shadows and falling numbers. She awoke not to a sound, but to a smell. It was sharp, acrid, and terrifyingly familiar. Smoke. She threw off her blankets, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She ran to the window and saw a nightmare painted in orange and red. The main barn, the massive timber structure that housed the winter feed and the prized breeding stock, was engulfed in flames. The fire was moving fast, driven by the relentless wind, licking at the dry grass that separated the barn from the main house. May did not scream. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. She threw on a heavy wool dress, shoved her feet into her boots, and ran into the main room. Elias was already there, pulling his suspenders over his shoulders, his face pale and tight. He grabbed a lantern and a heavy canvas tarp. He shouted for her to stay in the house to gather water in the kitchen, and bolted out the door. May ignored his command. She knew the ledgers were safe in her trunk. The house was not yet burning, but the horses in the barn would die if they were not freed. She grabbed a heavy woolen blanket, soaked it in the kitchen pump, and ran out into the chaotic night. The heat hit her like a physical blow, a wall of blistering air that sucked the moisture from her eyes and throat. The roar of the fire was deafening, a monstrous crackling beast consuming the dry timber. Elias was near the barn doors, fighting to haul them open against the wind and the heat, coughing violently as the thick black smoke rolled over him. May threw the wet blanket over her head and shoulders and ran to his side. Together, straining against the heavy wood, they managed to pry the doors apart. The interior was an inferno. The hayloft was fully ablaze, raining burning embers down onto the dirt floor. The horses screaming, a terrifying high-pitched sound of pure panic, kicking wildly in their stalls. Elias rushed in, throwing his tarp over the head of his massive draft horse, trying to blind it to the flames to lead it out. May ran to the other stalls. She did not have tarps. She used her voice and her hands. She spoke to the terrified animals in a low, steady rhythm, her hands moving quickly over the latches. She threw open the stall doors and slapped the horses hard on the hindquarters, driving them out into the open night. She choked on the thick smoke, her eyes streaming, the heat singing the ends of her hair. She freed 3 horses, moving deeper into the burning structure. She reached the last stall. It held a young mare, wild-eyed and rearing, striking out with iron-shod hooves. A burning timber from the loft above cracked ominously. May grabbed the mare's halter, pulling with all her negligible weight, shouting over the roar of the flames. The timber gave way. It crashed down, blocking the exit of the stall, showering them in sparks. The mare screamed and bolted backward. May was trapped. Through the smoke, Elias appeared. He saw the fallen beam, saw May pressed against the far wall of the stall. He did not hesitate. He threw his weight against the burning timber, his canvas jacket smoking, his hands wrapping around the blistering wood. He roared, a sound of pure desperate effort, and heaved the beam aside just enough to create a gap. He reached in, grabbed May by the waist, and hauled her out. They stumbled backward out of the barn just as the roof caved in, sending a massive plume of fire and sparks into the night sky. They collapsed on the dirt near the water trough, gasping for air, their chests heaving. The heat of the dying barn washed over them, but the wind was blowing the sparks away from the house. They had lost the feed, they had lost the structure, but the animals were safe, and the house stood. May sat up, coughing violently, her lungs burning. She looked at Elias. His face was blackened with soot, his eyebrows singed, and his hands were red and blistered. He was looking at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He reached out, his large, injured hand trembling slightly, and took her arm. He pulled her closer, examining her face, her soot-stained dress. He asked, his voice a harsh, ruined rasp, if she was burned. May shook her head, unable to speak, the adrenaline fading to leave behind a profound, shaking weakness. She looked at his hands. Without a word, she moved to the water trough, soaked a clean edge of her underskirt, and gently took his hands in hers. She began to clean the soot and ash from his burns, her touch as light as a feather. They sat there in the dirt, illuminated by the dying fire, the silence between them heavy and completely altered. It was the silence of a barrier utterly destroyed. Elias looked down at her dark head bent over his hands. He spoke, his voice quiet against the crackle of the embers. He told her about Sarah. He told her how the fever had come on fast, how he had ridden through a blizzard to get the doctor, and how he had been too late. He confessed the crushing, suffocating guilt that had made him build a wall around his life. A vow never to let anyone close enough to be lost again. May listened, her thumbs gently stroking the unburned skin of his wrists. When he finished, she did not offer platitudes. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She told him about the betrayal that had brought her to Oak Haven. She told him about the fear of being entirely erased, of dying in the dust without anyone knowing her name. She confessed her terror of the fire and her realization that she had run into it, not just for the horses, but because this ranch, this harsh, quiet life they had built in a few short weeks, was the only thing she had left to fight for. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the immense strength housed in her slender frame. He saw the soot on her cheek, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, and the gentle care in her hand. He realized with a profound and quiet certainty that the walls were gone, and he did not want to rebuild them. He closed his fingers gently around hers, stopping her cleaning. He held her hands, pressing them to his chest, over the steady, heavy beat of his heart. They sat together until the dawn broke, turning the eastern sky a pale, bruised purple, the smouldering ruins of the barn a testament to what they had survived. The morning light was harsh and unforgiving, exposing the black, smoking scar on the land. But there was no time for mourning the loss of the timber. Elias and May washed the soot from their faces, bandaged Elias's hands, and dressed in their cleanest clothes. May retrieved the leather-bound ledgers from her trunk, wrapping them carefully in a canvas sack. Elias strapped his heavy revolver to his hip. They saddled 2 of the surviving horses and rode toward Oak Haven. The silence between them was no longer tentative, it was forged steel. They arrived in town just as the mercantile was opening. The street was already busy with morning traffic, wagons rolling and townsfolk running errands. Elias did not tie his horse to the rail. He rode it straight up onto the boardwalk, stopping just inches from the heavy glass doors of Vance Mercantile. May stopped her horse beside him. The noise on the street died away, replaced by the tense, expectant silence of a crowd, recognizing impending violence. Elias dismounted, wincing slightly, as his burned hands grasped the saddle horn. He walked to the door and kicked it open. He did not draw his weapon. He walked to the center of the store, May following closely behind him, the canvas sack in her hands. Silas Vance was behind the counter, his smug expression faltering as he took in the soot-stained clothes and the cold, deadly purpose in Elias's eyes. Elias did not yell. He spoke in a voice that carried perfectly out the open door and into the street, drawing the townsfolk closer. He announced that his barn had burned in the night. He announced that he had found hoofprints near the back pasture that matched the distinct heavy shoeing of the horses ridden by Vance's hired men. Vance puffed up his chest, attempting to summon his usual bluster. He called Elias a liar, demanding he leave the store. Elias ignored him. He turned to May. May stepped forward, placing the heavy canvas sack on the counter. She pulled out the ledgers and opened them. She turned to face the gathering crowd in the doorway, which now included the town marshal and several prominent ranchers. She did not speak to Vance. She spoke to the town. She laid out the numbers. She explained with devastating clarity how Silas Vance had been altering interest rates, skimming profits from cattle sales, and overcharging for basic supplies. She named dates, she named amounts, and she named the specific ranches that had been affected alongside Ironwood. The crowd began to murmur, the sound growing into an angry rumble. Men who owed Vance money, men who had lost land to him, pushed their way into the store, demanding to see the books. The marshal, a stern man with a grey mustache, stepped up to the counter and pulled the ledgers toward him, his eyes scanning the meticulous columns May had constructed. Vance panicked. He lunged across the counter, attempting to grab the books, screaming that they were forged, that the woman was a lying vagrant. Elias moved faster than a man his size should be able to. He grabbed Vance by the collar of his expensive waistcoat, hauling him half over the polished oak counter. He pulled the merchant close, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He told Vance that if he ever set foot near Ironwood again, if he ever spoke May's name again, the marshal would not be able to save him. He threw Vance backward. The merchant crashed into a display of canned goods, collapsing in a pathetic, trembling heap. The marshal closed the ledger. He looked at Vance, then at the angry crowd of ranchers. He ordered his deputies to take Vance to the jailhouse, while an auditor from the county seat was summoned. The empire of Silas Vance, built on lies and petty tyranny, crumbled in the span of 10 minutes, destroyed by a column of numbers and the quiet courage of a woman he had tried to break. Elias and May walked out of the store, the crowd parting for them, no longer with suspicion, but with a stunned, profound respect. They walked to their horses, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbing away, leaving them standing in the bright, dusty sunlight of the street. Elias turned to May. He looked at her, his grey eyes clear and steady. He did not speak of the victory. He spoke of the future. He told her that the barn was gone and the winter would be hard. He told her that Ironwood was a lonely place, and he was a difficult man. He did not offer poetry or grand declarations of passion. He offered a partnership. He stated, his voice quiet but absolute, that he did not want a bookkeeper anymore. He wanted a wife. He wanted a partner to rebuild the barn, to run the herds, and to share the silence of the high valley. He asked her to stay, not as an employee, but as an equal. Mai stood still, the noise of the town fading away until there was only the sound of the wind and the steady gaze of the man before her. She felt the weight of her past, the betrayals and the losses pressing down on her. She felt she had nothing of value to bring to this partnership. No dowry, no land, no family name. She reached up her trembling fingers, unfastening the top button of her collar. She pulled out the thin silver chain, drawing the small, flawless circle of green jade from beneath her dress. She held it in her palm, looking down at the only piece of her history she had managed to save. "I only have this ring left," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time, the vulnerability she had hidden for so long finally cracking the surface. Elias did not hesitate. He reached out with his bandaged hand. He did not take the ring. Instead, he folded his large, rough fingers over hers, enclosing the jade and her hand within his own warm grasp. He looked deeply into her dark, tear-filled eyes, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Then keep it," he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of her doubts. "And keep me." 14 months later, the dust of Oak Haven still hovered, but the air in the high valley of Ironwood was crisp and clean. The scars of the fire were gone, replaced by the fresh, pale timber of a massive new barn, built twice as large and smelling of sweet pine and cured hay. The winter feed was stacked high, and the prized breeding stock stamped comfortably in their clean stalls. The ranch was thriving, the ledgers were perfectly balanced, and the debt to the bank had been entirely cleared following the county's seizure of Silas Vance's assets. The town of Oakhaven had changed its tune entirely. When the Thorn wagon rolled into town now, hats were tipped, and polite greetings were exchanged. May Thorn was no longer the desperate outsider. She was a respected pillar of the community, known for her sharp mind, her fair dealings, and the incredible gardens she had coaxed from the hard ironwood soil. Silas Vance was a memory serving time in a federal penitentiary, his name spoken only as a cautionary tale of greed. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows across the porch of the main house. The air was cooling, hinting at the approaching autumn. May sat in a rocking chair, a basket of mending on her lap, though her hands were currently still. She wore a dress of sturdy, deep blue cotton, and the jade ring gleamed quietly on her finger, catching the fading light. She was watching the road. Elias rode into the yard, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. He dismounted, tending to his horse with the slow, careful movements of a man who loved his work. He walked toward the porch, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth. He looked tired, covered in the inevitable dust of the range. But the heavy, suffocating grief that had once defined his posture was completely gone. He carried himself with a quiet, grounded peace. He climbed the steps and did not go inside. He stopped beside her chair, resting his hand lightly on her shoulder. His hands were fully healed, though faint, white scars traced the backs of his knuckles, a permanent reminder of the night they had saved the ranch and found each other. May reached up, covering his hand with her own, her thumb tracing the familiar ridges of his scars. They did not speak. There was no need for words. They looked out over the valley, watching the shadows lengthen and the sky turn a brilliant, fiery orange. They listened to the sounds of their shared life, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of the wind in the oak trees, and the steady, comforting rhythm of their own breathing. They had built a fortress, not of walls to keep the world out, but of trust and mutual respect, a sanctuary forged in fire and bound by a quiet, unbreakable love. The frontier remained harsh and unforgiving, but as the first stars pricked through the twilight sky, they knew they would face whatever came next, together. The silence on the porch was deep and profoundly peaceful. The sound of two souls who had wandered through the darkest valleys and finally, remarkably, come home.